We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Janelle Aaker. She is the former VP Global Diversity and Inclusion at lululemon. Janelle, thank you so much for being on the show. If you want to start off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks, Christina. I'm so excited to be here. Yes, so my name is Janelle Aaker. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I live in Vancouver, BC, and currently consulting on all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I was younger, if you had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, my most common answer was teacher. But I will say over time, it sometimes shifted to different things like news broadcaster or astronaut. But most consistently, I would have told you that I wanted to be a teacher when I grew up.
I love that. There's so much education into all of the things that you have done in your career thus far. And I always like to ask people about their personal journey to where they are today. So how do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess maybe a starting point is to reflect on where I am today. So if I reflect on where I'm at today, like I said, I live in Vancouver, BC. I am married with 3 kids. Let's see what else. I'm studying to be a mindfulness meditation teacher. And I've also become deeply spiritual and have spent a lot of time looking inward and reflecting on my thoughts and my ego and things like that. And professionally, I've had a career in mostly HR, but also DEI, and I've been really active in employee resource groups. And like I already mentioned, when I was younger, I thought I would be a teacher. If you were to maybe go up to my 20-year-old self, I still think my 20-year-old self would, not in her wildest dreams, think that I would be here doing all these things that I just said and having all those experiences. But, when I do look back on my life, the last couple decades at least, the experiences I've had and the decisions I've made, when you look at all those together, then absolutely it makes sense that I am where I am today. Because when I look over the past couple decades, I have experienced depression in multiple levels and forms. Like I said, I've had a career in HR. I'm an empath. So by nature, I'm empathetic and a high empath. And so just by my nature of being an empath and being in society and then being in the corporate world, I've seen a lot of inequities. And I've, in my time being, active in employee resource groups, but also being in HR, where, I'm working with a variety of employees, and I've always worked for global organizations. So, meeting so many people along the way, I've heard a lot of stories of varying experiences. And, the more I learn, the more I can't unsee and unknow what I know. As I hear all those employee journeys, I become more and more aware of the inequities and more aware of the challenges that some people have and others don't. And so I'm not the type of person to sit back and watch that happen without doing something to help the situation. So, knowing that that's my nature and knowing that, I've had a career where I've, met a lot of people and worked for large, multinational organizations. It's not necessarily that surprising that I landed in diversity, equity, and inclusion work as my full-time role.
Yeah. No, I think that is really interesting. It sounds like a lot of lived and learned experience, especially around equity. And I do want to to talk about your work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because in our previous conversation, something that really struck me, and you touched on this too, in terms of being reflective and focusing on mindfulness, which is something that a lot of folks have kind of prioritized over these past two years as well, maybe some for the first time. Why is it important that really mental health initiatives at corporations are under kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion instead of kind of benefits in your mind?
Yeah, I have a really strong opinion about this, and no disrespect to the work that benefits teams are doing in this space. Um, but when you think about the extent of their support for mental health falls in benefits, meaning that maybe the company has an employee EAP program where they can access support 24/7 and access counselors, so employee assistance programs. That's a real common support benefit. Beyond that, there isn't much. And, having had my own lived experience and having used EAP, for me, it wasn't enough support. It really didn't help all that much, other than it made me feel better that I was trying to get help, that I was doing something. But in terms of getting me to a potential solution to feel happy again and happier, it wasn't anywhere near what I needed. And when you think about an EAP program, or, the programs where, if you're experiencing hard times or troubles, you can call and access them. Really, if you think about that point in someone's life, if they've gotten to that point, they're already in a troubling situation. And the reason I like reimagining where this work sits and moving it into your DEI efforts is, one, when it sits in DEI, it's acknowledging it is part of our diversity. So statistically, 1 in 5, 1 in 4, depending on where you're getting your data, 1 in 4 people will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. So that's part of our diversity. That's part of when you look around an office or a company, it's the diversity that's around you. You might not know it's there, but it's there. Inclusion is about acknowledging the diversity that exists and giving everyone the opportunity to thrive. And so when you think about inclusion work, you're supporting people with mental illness to feel like they belong and it's okay to be who they are, and let's get you the support that you need. And so when you set that tone in your organization, you make it easier for people to ask for help. Again, I hid my illness for 20 years. Not one person at any organization I worked at knew. And in fact, they probably would have described me as being incredibly happy and positive, which was just my defense mechanism. But in reality, I was suffering a lot, and I was really emotionally exhausted to be at work all day, putting up that front. However, if I was working at an organization that, it was openly acknowledged that this is part of everyday life, and that, hey, we know that some of you are dealing with this and it's okay. Let us talk to you about it. Let us help you get the support you need. Then I most likely wouldn't have waited as long as I did to share with someone and then to ask for the support I need. It really took a crisis situation from my life where I finally admitted, only just a few years ago, admitted that I wasn't well, talked with coworkers about it, and then got the help that I needed and took time away from work. I took a month off of work. But again, I think a DEI strategy that has mental health in it would be considering, how do we create the conditions that make our employees with mental illness, and there are many of them, statistically speaking, we know many of them have experienced varying forms of mental illness. The DEI strategy would make it okay, would honor that diversity, and proactively create the support mechanisms to ideally prevent it from getting to a crisis situation for someone.
Well, number one, thank you for sharing kind of your personal journey and kind of story here. I think there still exists a lot of stigma about sharing this with coworkers, your team members, your manager, even your company, and just sharing your story. I hope like impacts others who are also listening and perhaps struggling too. I mean, that statistic that you shared, the odds are that a lot of folks, we just don't know who is struggling and who's not. You can never assume someone's story. I do want to touch on that proactivity piece in terms of creating that structure to be really supportive. Can
Mhm.
you provide any kind of real mental health strategy examples that go beyond the more performative benefits to check that box that we have, mental health benefits, or we have, a monthly meditation. So that is checking that
Yeah,
box.
absolutely. And again, a lot of companies are in that sphere of this work, and no disrespect to that work, it can be helpful, but it's not going to solve any problems, nor will it really help your employees to the extent that they need it. So I think, you talked about the stigma around it. That's huge. And that plays a big part in why people hide it. And the unknown of what happens. For me, it was the unknown. What's going to happen? At this point, I was already an executive when I finally shared my journey. And I even, I was an executive in HR, and yet I still didn't know what would happen to me when I admitted that I was seriously ill. I didn't know if I would immediately be taken away from my job. I didn't know if I would be sent to a hospital. Like, I really didn't know. And I worked in HR and I was an executive. So I think when I think about, all the other employees who might be having the same questions, and of course, I started to have depression when I was an individual contributor. But all those times, the not knowing of what would happen and the impact it might have on my family or my career was really scary. And so I think one of the first things is, as best as you can, destigmatize the topic, create points of conversation as much as possible, not just in October when it's World Mental Health Day, but every month there should be conversations and vulnerability to share what's going on. I think equipping people managers with tools to spot the signs and better support employees. Because I think oftentimes, mental illness might be incorrectly labeled as poor performance. And while poor performance might be an outcome of the mental illness, the reality is if they get healthy, then their performance could be great. And so, I think many times the conversation becomes about performance. And then even more so, someone is going to hide, I think, what's going on, because they don't want to jeopardize their ability to keep their job. They don't want another strike against them. And so I think helping managers, people managers, spot the signs that something is off for an employee, and then equip them with the right language and the right questions to ask, and also the right avenue, like where do you send someone next? Because what we wouldn't want is managers to feel like they need to be counselors themselves. That is not what I would recommend. But a manager can create that pathway to get the right support, whatever that is, however that's set up in the organization. I think there's a growing number of mental first aid responders, mental health first aiders. So there's a training that people can go through to become like a mental health first aid person in an organization. And I think that's brilliant, getting more people who are more qualified and can be counted on. Just like you have people who are deemed your first aid people if there's an earthquake or the building needs to be evacuated. Most organizations have that person designated and they help shepherd people out. Similarly, when people are going through mental health crises, having someone that recognizes the signs and knows exactly what to do in that trauma situation is really important. So kudos to the companies that are doing that already. I think more people should get certified in mental health first aid. And then last, I would have loved to have had a full-time psychologist or counselor or therapist on site at my organization. This might sound funny. I just started binge watching Ted Lasso. So Saturday, I watched the entire first season. And then yesterday we started the second season. And I know this is a fictional story and situation, but the sports psychologist that they bring in season 2, and the impact that she has on the players and the organization is far reaching. And that's what I'm talking about. When you have someone who is equipped to be able to provide in-time support when it's needed and in-person support, that's huge. And I really wanted to have someone on staff that could have office hours and could also just be on hand when someone just needed someone. I think that would be a wise investment. And that gets more to a proactive mental health strategy as opposed to a reactive strategy.
I think that's important to highlight as well. And I know kind of you're mentioning Ted Lasso, but I have heard of other companies really investing in this resource for their employees because they know it's really important to their overall well-being and their mental health, and also just to make sure that they're offering resources that people will really take advantage of as well, and making that accessible too, because we know that therapy and having access to a psychologist isn't always accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned too that you were able to really take kind of a month off as well and really come back, return to work as an executive, your positionality in the company. Can you talk about how it can be proactive and kind of setting up a tangible structure for employees to take leave and return to work? So others need to take advantage of this as well and really kind of use this as a resource. They know how to do it and what the process is.
Yeah. And to be honest, Christina, I probably wouldn't have a good idea of how best to support them if I hadn't gone through it myself. I would have really had to defer to a professional to, guide us on how do we best support employees to take a leave and to come back. But, what I can share is my own personal experience. So I took a full month off to get help. And, my plan to come back, I was planning to come back full time. And, before I even left, I was telling my manager and my team, don't worry, I'm going to be back. And, I'll be back full time. I'm, really hopeful that this is going to be exactly what I need and all that stuff. The good thing is that my time off did help me tremendously. It really did get me to a really clear and good place. But what I didn't anticipate was the challenge of coming back full time, mostly because, after having spent a full month completely separated from work and really from my family too, I was away from my family during that time. And I had just all the time in the world to really spend time examining my reactions and examining my thoughts, going on 2-hour silent walks, doing yoga, doing meditation, doing all these tools and things that helped. Going back to full-time work as well as a family of 3 kids and a husband, I was a bit overwhelmed, but also stressed that I didn't have time to do all my things, that kept me healthy. And so thankfully, this is when I was at Lululemon. Thankfully, coworkers and my manager at the time, they all recognized that, you should really be gentle with yourself. If you had a major physical injury, you wouldn't go right back into running a marathon. And they were right. When they first suggested that I consider part-time work, I actually got offended. My ego shot right up and thought, oh my goodness, who are they to say that I can't do this? And what are they suggesting that I can't, I'm not performing well, that I need to. And when I realized that what my ego was doing, and when I actually heard their suggestion as a kind gesture, I completely changed my attitude and said, wow, what a wonderful offer they're giving me to go part-time for a while. And how great to have 2 full days a week to be able to do my, inward looking and my long walk and my meditations and all those things. And so I went back to them and said, I think you're right. I think I do need to work part-time. And this hadn't been done for an executive at Lululemon, but they were very open and eager to make it work. And so at first I suggested 2 months of part-time, and they're like, no, 6 months. And I thought, you got to be kidding, 6 months of part-time. They said, I really think that you should give yourself this time. And I think, I thank them every day in my heart, because it was really what I needed. And it set me up for more sustained success in my mental health. So yeah, so that's what I did. I'm not saying, I don't know if everybody would needs the same back to work support. Well, actually, I know not everybody needs this. It requires the same. Everyone is a unique individual, and that's what the equity work is like understanding exactly what someone needs. So I think, if I were to design a program now, I would create the process to include a really like open communication even before someone goes on leave. Maybe loose expectations about what return would look like. We don't have to set it in stone right now, because who knows what a month from now will look like? Who knows what you would need? I mean, you're really making assumptions. So like loose expectations, and create the conditions where someone doesn't have to fear those loose expectations, like the job security and whatnot. And create the conditions where their work can be maintained by other people, so they don't have that pressure that they're letting the team down. Just like we support people that go out on parental leave. In many places they have a backfill. Someone is doing their job for them, so they can rest assured that the work is getting done and that the team isn't burdened with their absence. Similarly, people with mental illness, if they go out on leave, shouldn't be burdened with the thought that they're putting their team out because they're gone, and then feel rushed to come back. So really putting in the resources so that people can be covered, and that we can be flexible with what a return to work looks like. Because then when they do return, having really open, honest conversations about what is needed then.
Absolutely. I think it's about meeting folks where they are. You're right. Every individual is different. So that two-way conversation is really important. The operationalizing it a little bit to set those loose expectations. So someone, when they do kind of, need to take that option or have the conversation, they're not like, I have no idea where to start. I have no idea, they talk about that and kind of the conversation touch points you talked about earlier too. So not only in October, just having it as part of a manager check-in and making sure that it's not taboo to talk about at work.
Yeah. Yep.
Another piece of the conversation that you and I have discussed, as well as in terms of programming and structure for your role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of kind of leaders talk about it being a strategic business unit, or directly kind of leading up to the CEO of a company or a leader. Can you talk us through what that looks like in your kind of ideal state and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. Having been in the work myself and then consulting for the past year, I've seen a lot of different structures. And to be honest, at the end of the day, the role and the work can be placed anywhere in the organization, literally, like that's a fact. It can be anywhere.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, is if a company wants meaningful and impactful change, if they want to move towards a more inclusive culture, they want to move towards, let's say, an anti-racist organization, well, then they're going to want to think through where they place the role and at what level. And so my suggestion, if a company is really serious about improving the experience of employees and making their workplace equitable, like truly equitable for all, inclusive for all, and moving towards an anti-racist organization, then there is only one place for the head of DEI to be, and that's reporting to the CEO. Anywhere else, it's going to be a real challenge. It's not impossible to be successful in the work. I really haven't seen it done yet if it's not reporting to a CEO. But when it reports to a CEO, it's in the right conversations. It has the right level of influence in the organization. It has the ear of the CEO and the mind space of the CEO. There's a direct report. They're getting one-on-ones. They're in all of the budget planning sessions. They're in all the team meetings, the offsites, the strategy building. Below that, they're likely missing out on a lot of those conversations and a lot of those meetings. Their voice is not at the table. They don't have all the information. And they don't have the influence. They also don't have the ability to secure the right amount of budget. This work requires a significant budget because we're talking about transformational change in an organization, and that requires a lot of resources to do. And then lastly, what I've thought about a lot recently is the interconnectedness between DEI work and HR work. And while I don't believe DEI work is solely in the realm of HR, because I believe it extends beyond the employee experience, it also applies to supplier diversity and your brand marketing and, your community relations and all that. So beyond the employee experience, a big part of DEI work is the employee experience. That's a lot of what many companies focus on. They want to make their own ship, their own house well before they look externally. And I think that's a good approach. Make sure that you've, really buttoned things up in your own house before you go, saying that you're doing things externally. So there's a lot of interconnectedness in HR work, and a lot of the success of that employee experience relies on the HR function being able to evolve and mature and look at everything through a DEI lens. And when your head of DEI sits outside of HR, it can be really difficult to hold the HR team accountable because you don't performance manage them at all. You don't, at the end of the day, have any say of how their budget is divvied up within the HR function. So with competing priorities within an HR function, the DEI initiatives might take a back seat. And there's really nothing to hold them accountable to keeping it as a priority. And so what I've really believed as of late is that a chief diversity and equity officer should report to the CEO, and the head of HR should report to your chief diversity and equity officer. So the HR function should move under DEI. And that, I believe, will create the right amount of accountability, the right development for the HR function, because there's a lot of upskilling that an HR function would need to be able to look at everything through a DEI lens. And I think being in the DEI function will give them that mindset shift, but also secure the development required. So that's really where my thinking is today, as I've been contemplating how do we make this work successful, trying different things with different organizations, and nothing quite sticks like we want it to. There's obstacles everywhere, and different obstacles at different places. But I think this could be a real move forward to structure it that way and to see what happens.
I think that's an interesting organizational structure and so important to what you mentioned in terms of accountability, resourcing with time, with executive leadership buy-in, with just tracking towards goals, and really holding everyone kind of accountable and kind of measuring progress. I think that is really important. And what we're talking about too, not only with talent and HR, but also just throughout the organization, making it more equitable, whether you're in marketing, sales, talent acquisition, making sure everyone is on the same page. Because at the end of the day, you want employees to feel like they belong, feel like there is equity and opportunity, and make sure that people feel like they are being heard and seen. And part of that is around kind of employee happiness and just regular happiness. We know you can't be happy all the time. That is very unsustainable. But what are qualitative and quantitative ways we can measure kind of employee happiness within the context of company culture? What are your thoughts on that?
Love that question. And it's tricky because I believe so you've kind of touched on a couple of things. You talked about culture and happiness. Mm-hmm. And I think for culture, if you're inside an organization, you can almost feel the culture. So I don't believe culture is what a company says on their website. I believe culture is the everyday habits and decisions and behaviors that occur within an organization. That's the culture. So if you're inside a company, you will see and experience the culture day in and day out just by nature of being in it. So that's the culture piece. When it comes to happiness, employee happiness, I don't think there's any real way to measure that aside from asking people directly and having them answer for themselves, because we might make an assumption that everybody is happy, and it might look like everyone is happy based on how they act in meetings. And the truth might be they're not happy. And I know this because I was that person that fooled everybody. So I think the only way to really measure employee happiness in an organization is to ask them, and to ask them frequently. I think a one-time, annual survey about happiness is not going to be that helpful, because it's a point in time, and so much can influence that person's decision on that day. Like if you were to ask someone to rate their happiness on that day, something as simple as how their morning commute went, or morning school drop off, or what their manager said right before they took the survey, can influence in that moment. So, but if you ask regularly, like a pulse check every 2 weeks, over a year, you'll have really aggregate data that will give you, I think, a fairly accurate reading of employee happiness. But you have to let employees share their data themselves. We cannot assume or make guesses just based on how a culture feels, because it could feel happy, but until you ask someone to share honestly, and really allow them to share honestly, you won't really know. So I think surveys are the way to go, and to have them as frequently as possible, and then track the data over time and aggregate it.
Absolutely. You have to ask on an ongoing basis for feedback. We believe at AllVoices too, in that psychological safety and ensuring that people can share that feedback as well. And that point in time is really, I think that's important to highlight, because there's so much context that can go behind that as well. Your perspective, how do you see just employee feedback management as an important tool of just building that culture of trust and listening? And how does that really manifest in other ways at the organization?
Yeah, I am a big fan of gathering employee feedback and using it, because I really do, after, again, having been in HR for quite a while, I really believe that companies need to listen to their employees and follow their employees' lead. So if employees are telling you that these benefits aren't working, and these are these other benefits are what they need, listen to them. The answer lies within your organization. When I think about executives sitting in a room thinking about what do we need to change, and all these things around talent strategies or talent plans, I always find myself sitting in there thinking, why are the 5 of us trying to guess all of this? Why don't we just ask our employees? It's so much simpler and so much better. It's not necessarily easier, because it's a lot of data to go through. So you gotta have the time and the resources to go through the data and analyze it thoughtfully. But I think your solutions and your strategies, in terms of employee engagement and employee happiness and career growth and all those things, DEI initiatives, they're going to be so much better if they're informed by your employees' voices, as opposed to a handful of executives sitting in a conference room pounding out a strategy. So I think employee feedback is incredibly important. I think, the more you can gather it on a frequent basis, again, I can't stress that enough, have constant dialogue with your employees, constant feedback loops, and ways to aggregate it, and also just have conversations about their feedback in a timely manner. I really love what Humu is doing, the organization Humu. They have these nudges and this whole system of employee feedback that, is a kind of on a weekly basis. And so, I piloted it as a manager. I piloted the program, and I thought it was phenomenal that every single Friday, I knew what my employees loved and loathed that week. And that is really good data. So then on Monday, we could have a direct conversation about what happened just last week. And it's timely. And it's really important to be timely and to resolve any friction if there is, and to continue clearing paths when things are going well. And so it's that constant feedback loop. And I think it should be at the manager and the employee level. Obviously, leaders need to know as well, like how an organization is doing, how their function is doing. But the real work happens at that frontline manager level. So a frontline manager really needs to have constant feedback from their direct reports and needs to be alleviating the hardships and the pain and the friction and clearing paths for the wins and what's working. And the best way to do that is to have open and honest dialogue. And so, yeah, I think constant feedback, if an organization takes the feedback seriously and does something with it, it will build trust in the organization, and it will build honesty too. I think people aren't always honest in feedback surveys or in one-on-one conversations with a manager because they haven't built that trust yet, and they don't have the psychological safety that you talked about, that, hey, my feedback, whether good, bad, or ugly, is valued and respected. And so you have to demonstrate that the feedback will be respected, and until it's demonstrated, they probably won't give it.
I think that timely piece is so important, and you not only want to collect this feedback, but you want to have a conversation about it. You want to act on it, and if you're not going to act on it, you have to explain the why behind it. You have to communicate. Again, nobody wants to feel like they gave all of these like really constructive feedback, really positive or negative, and it didn't go anywhere, and nobody read it or didn't do anything with it.
I don't want people to underestimate the emotional labor to give that feedback. So every time you ask someone to give this honest feedback, if they're being honest and vulnerable, that took emotional labor to do it. And so, especially if you're going to ask them frequently to do that, to put themselves out there on the line, you want to honor that, and you want to respect it, and you want to do something with that and respond. Even if you're still working on something, you need to give them a timely response, even if the response is, we're reading through your feedback, and, we're taking our time to really, dig through it. And so we're going to need another week or whatever it is, whatever your timeline is, but don't just go silent on people.
Right. Nobody wants to hear that. And also you're less likely to give the feedback next time if you're just like, what last time I don't understand what happened in the communication. What are kind of key ingredients to really ensure that those people managers are practicing this, equity-driven leadership, and really hold people accountable to make sure that, we are building these systems that, create psychological safety and empower teams to do their best work?
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a big question. And I often say, when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, when I work with a new organization, I'll be the first to say that every single person in the organization can contribute to a more inclusive culture. So when it comes to inclusion, every person can play a part. Every person can adopt more inclusive behaviors, habits. They can deepen their own understanding and learning. When it comes to equity work, my thoughts is like, not everyone can play in the equity work, because not everyone maybe is in those decision-making roles around changing a policy or a process that is, systemically biased and has, inherent systemic, discrimination or oppression in it that's creating the inequity. So, when I think about what a manager can do and how do we hold them accountable, I think we should hold all managers accountable to inclusive leadership. And inclusive leadership can entail many things, but I think, listening and empathy and, being aware of their words and their impact, also aware of their own biases. So they need to have some self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and, lead, in that way. And so inclusive and empathetic leadership is important for all people managers. When it comes to creating equity and equitable practices, there are some things that absolutely all managers could do, just making sure, like meetings, everyone has an equal chance and equitable chance to contribute in a brainstorm. And, depending on what someone might need to join the meeting or to participate in the meeting, whether they need accessibility or, they need time to process information ahead of time, give them a pre-read, whatever it might be, a manager should understand what their employees need or the meeting attendees need to have an equitable chance to contribute. and to be heard, absolutely they can do those little things. And to be able to do that, they need to learn that, because my sense is that many people don't understand equity, and they don't even know where to start, and they don't know what to do. So there is some just upskilling and knowledge base that needs to happen for people managers. The real deep systemic equity work that an organization needs to do, that's on the hands of the senior leaders, the HR department, the DEI team, the CEO, because you're talking about systemic change and changing how you operate as an organization. And that's harder for individual contributors or even frontline managers to make that big of system-wide change. They can change their own world, absolutely, for the better. But when you're talking about system-wide change and how performance management is done and promotions are made and determined, compensation practices, that's, oftentimes a privileged group of people that have influence on that. And so that's where those people have a disproportionate role to play in the systemic equity of an organization.
Speaking of kind of senior leaders and really thinking about equity-driven leadership, I know we also talked about you have kind of strong thoughts and philosophies around the role of specifically the CHRO today, and what reframing should look like as well. Can you share what that reframe looks like in your mind?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, I think if we're coming at it from a DEI lens and we want the DEI work to succeed, I believe that organizations should move towards a structure where the HR function, whatever it's called, people, talent, people and culture, HR, whatever it's called, that function that's responsible for the employee life cycle and employee experience should move under your head of DEI. Now, what does that happen to a CHRO or your head of people or head of talent? Well, it might mean that the role is redundant, or it might just mean that it's a subordinate role. But in any case, if it doesn't happen that the HR function moves under a DEI lead, and you're keeping the status quo of a structure, what I believe it means for a CHRO is that most CHROs out there today will need significant DEI upskilling and training, because most kind of DEI principles and practices were not taught early in, and you think about who these people are, they've got a long tenured career. So they started their HR career a long time ago. And if they went to school for HR, that was a long time ago. Even if you do some, recent, kind of education, yeah, there might be a course on DEI, but that doesn't mean that you've had a lot of lived experience implementing DEI work. And like I said, DEI work does require HR business partners and recruiters and compensation analysts and HRIS, systems people to look at their work differently, to think, okay, who is marginalized here and who are we unintentionally marginalizing or holding back in our structures and in our policies and our processes and programs. And so a CHRO and an entire HR function really needs to think differently. And for the most part, I find that they're underskilled in this area. And it's not their fault, they are where they are because of, the access to that type of training, but the training exists. And now it's on those functions to invest in that training. Having worked in HR, I know that the HR function is oftentimes under-resourced in terms of an operating budget. So I empathize, because there isn't usually nearly enough dollars to actually invest in your own function as an HR team. So that's where tough conversations have to happen with the CEO, is like, give us the adequate budget to upskill our people. But I do think CHROs in the near future need to think of themselves as CDOs, Chief Diversity Officers, even if there is a counterpart in the organization, or maybe there isn't, maybe there isn't someone in the organization, but if not them, then who? It has to fall on someone's shoulders. And I do think CHROs need to be thinking of themselves as that person. And even if, again, I want to say this, even if there is a person that is heading up DEI, whether in the organization, in the HR function, or as a peer, CHROs still have to think like a chief diversity and equity and inclusion officer. They have to. Otherwise, their function is not going to progress, because all roads lead to the leader of the function.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you there. And I think it's really important to not maintain the status quo for the sake of maintaining the status quo, but really think about organizational structure, really think about that resourcing time, and really keeping folks accountable and setting people up for success too in their individual roles. In kind of consulting around this work as well, are there any other common mistakes you see people making?
Yeah, I think the most common mistake when I get new clients, I think many clients and many organizations think that training is going to solve everything. Training is the end all be all, particularly training on unconscious bias. And I'm not against training on unconscious bias. I think everyone should understand how biases work and the origins of them. So people should be deeply aware of how their biases have formed. And what they will learn is there's a few key areas where they're developed in our cultural upbringing, institutional learning, early experiences and whatnot. But society plays a big part. So because we have a society in North America that is rampant with systemic oppression, our biases that have formed further perpetuate the oppression, because that's the world in which we are operating in, and that's where our biases are being formed from. Is everything around us is steeped in colonialism and oppressive practices. Sorry, that's my puppy. Oppressive practices. And so while it's important for everyone to understand their biases, training on unconscious bias is not going to create major shifts. Systemic change and systemic transformation is going to create the shifts needed. So I think that's the biggest misunderstanding that organizations have.
I think that is a huge misunderstanding. I see a lot of people, especially in terms of training, events, programming, celebration is one part of it, but it isn't the end all be all as well. This large systemic change, again, not upholding the status quo and really looking internally too, going back to the top of the conversation, it has a lot to do with individual self-awareness too, to hold yourself accountable as a leader. Is there anything that I didn't ask you during our conversation? I know we touched on a lot of different topics, but or 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope our audience brings with them after listening to our episode today?
I mean, I guess, if I were to share just some key takeaways, I encourage everyone to challenge the status quo and really think through how can things be done differently. Because DEI work or, reimagining culture is all going to require doing things differently. And it's going to require change. So that has to start with the possibility that change could happen. So I would really encourage people to think outside the box and challenge the status quo and challenge their own thinking. And then last but not least, just be curious at all times. Never stop learning, never stop meeting people with different backgrounds, never stop reading articles or, information from a variety of sources, because the more you know, the better you can do.
Absolutely. Stay curious, be a lifelong learner. I think that's one of my philosophies too. Janelle, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture.
Thank you, Christina.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we believe in that employee feedback management, and we know that getting all those voices and that feedback is a requirement for the company to succeed on a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.